What if your private practice was a space for your healing and growth too? What if we could move our practices from a stress-driven business model to a practice that grows as we thrive? What if we become courageous leaders and agents of change through our practices? Join us as we explore the journeys of inspiring psychologists who are healing through private practice. Hello, and welcome to the Inspiring Psychologists podcast. In this episode, we are talking about healing our connection with community and escaping the grind in private practice. I think that one of the most challenging things that we encounter when we come into private practice is working out for ourselves how we define success, and even moving away from this kind of extractive hustle culture that seems to be rooted in making as much money as possible in a short amount of time. And the problem with that is we end up burning out, and we end up kind of in a place where we're working all the hours, and therefore we are disconnected from our community, and that impacts our well-being. And so when I think about regenerative practices, a lot of talk in the regenerative world is about how are we rooted in community, and how are we kind of connected to the place in which we practice. And I think that's a really interesting question as a psychologist, because very often what we're taught as professionals is about being separate from our community, being distant, and almost that is a safer way to practice when we're not connected with the community in which we're working. And so I find this a really challenging place to navigate, which is, thinking about how do we find a way to flourish in harmony and in connection with our community, and even to be a part of the resourcing of our community as well. Also, I know that, if we're thinking about all the things that cause us to feel as though we're languishing, or as though, some of the traumatic experiences we may have had as people before we go into private practice, or even, whilst we're in private practice. One of the things that I remember reading was, that the impact of trauma is about us developing patterns of protection as opposed to patterns of connection. And so, the healing process is about healing that connection with ourselves, and then moving on to thinking about how do we heal our connection with community. And so for me, again, it kind of comes back to what are the ways in which we can build more community connection in a way in our practices that allows us to thrive, and allows and resources the community around us to thrive as well. And so today I'm going to be joined by Dr. Gemma Parker and Dr. Amy Woolston, and I'm just inviting you into the podcast here, who are psychologists that have developed practices that are very rooted in community. So welcome, Gemma, and welcome, Amy. Can I ask both of you to do a little bit of introduction to yourselves and to your kind of backstory on your practices, please? Gemma, I'm going to come to you first, if that's all right.
That's fine. Thank you, Wendy. Thanks for having me. A bit of backstory, yes. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and I trained some years ago and went into the NHS. Actually, I was in the NHS before that. Did my training, stayed in the NHS in secure hospitals in psychiatric care with people, and I'm thinking as I'm talking, how does this backstory lead to working with communities? And I think partly that was my struggle. So part of my struggle working within those systems was that I felt quite disconnected from the community that was supposed to be the community that we were serving. And disconnected because of certain policies, the way things were commissioned, the way that we were and weren't allowed to be agents within that system.
Yeah.
And because of some really quite difficult culture issues within that organisation. And I made the really difficult decision about 6 years ago, probably, to come out of the NHS, at least out of the NHS that I was working in at the time. And I needed something different. I needed something different for me. I was pretty burnt out, to use a phrase that might be familiar to people. The only way that I could do that in line with my values as a practitioner, and in line with somebody like I was still in love with the NHS. I believe in it as a
Yeah. Yeah.
system, but couldn't remain in it the way it was functioning for me. The only way that I could come out was to set up what is it now, a community interest company. So it's a type of social enterprise, so that I was able to think quite broadly about how I work as a practitioner in what could be called private practice, and some people might call it the voluntary sector. But the CIC allows us to apply for funding, to do
Yeah.
certain things that are free for people to access, or at least low cost for people to access, to have more of a sense of community as a result of that, as well as having what some people might see as a more traditional kind of private practice route as well. But that was, I think,
Yeah.
I guess that's a bit of the backstory and why I felt that I had to come out then, and why I chose to work in the way that I am trying to do. It's still a process. I don't feel like it's a
Yeah.
fait accompli. But
So
yeah.
tell us a little bit about Altogether Human, though, because
Mhm.
that's my understanding of the name of your organisation.
That's right, yeah. So Altogether Human is a community interest company. I co-direct that with another psychologist, a counselling psychologist, Yasmina, and we set that up a little while ago, along with a couple of colleagues who no longer work within the CIC. And it's a CIC that is predominantly for people who want to improve their relationships, where there might be experiences of conflict within relationships, or traumatic experiences, and that they want to heal from those. And those might be family relationships, romantic relationships, or sometimes actually other relationships too, friendships. And we have ways of working with people individually, as couples, as families, but also we have a sort of community, calling it an arm is too much, but a way of providing some space for more community-based activities as well.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Amy, welcome. Dr. Amy Woolston, if I'm correct, in
That's
formal
correct.
terms.
Yes.
So
That's
tell
what I
me a
go.
little bit about you, your work, your backstory, please.
Yeah. Okay. There's similar elements to Gemma's. I think I qualified in 2007 and also worked in the NHS for a long time. I worked in CAMS and I worked in perinatal services as well, and also had my own family, towards the end or middle end of my NHS career. And there was some sort of elements of the system that I struggled with, that we were spread so very thin. There was no sense of community. It was a very individual approach to treating perinatal mental health difficulties. And I think that goes against a lot of what I believe women, dads need at that time. And it also, personally, it was a really difficult experience for me, being there after my second child and becoming pregnant with my third. It just was definitely not the right job at that particular time. And so I left, and had talked about this kind of like fantasy idea with a couple of colleagues, on and off, on and off. So I had a really loose idea of what it might be like. And that was enough to get it started. And again, doing the research, similar to Gemma, it needed to be a CIC, a social enterprise. And I set that up with my colleague Adele, and I definitely couldn't have done it without her. I'm not a natural leader. And just having her there, you know, to be in partnership with me to keep steady, keep steering, and reminding us where we were heading was what I needed, definitely. So the koala tree is we just sort of say it's a psychological service for expectant and new parents who have struggled with the transition to parenthood. So we do traditional individual therapy, and that's, as Gemma was saying, that's kind of like our traded income. That's where we make the majority of our earnings and cover the business costs. But as a CIC, we're also in a position to apply for funding. And the other branch of our service is community groups. I've come from a group this morning. It's a facilitated support group. So we just come along, we do a check-in and decide what we want to use the time for. And I just facilitate the conversation, but the power comes from the group, really. We run a dad's group on a Tuesday evening, and I can get into this a bit more, but we've got a stay and play as well running, and that's led by our peer support worker.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Because that, you can imagine, I'm an occupational psychologist, so that immediately starts getting me thinking about, oh yeah, of course, in these community interest companies and these very community focused companies, this isn't just about us being psychologists going and doing psychology to communities, right? This is about different models of leadership and different models of connecting and supporting one another. So I'm very curious about that. When you kind of, one of the things that stood out to me there, Amy, when you mentioned I'm not a natural leader, and you said it in conjunction with, well, I worked with Adele to kind of set up this this company, and it, I'm thinking about how a community, a connected community-based company would have a different model and a different way of operating. That just says to me, maybe, or raises the question for me, maybe leadership of these companies looks different from what we might guess is traditional leadership. And I think both of you have set these up collectively. So this is a bit of an exam question. When you think about the leadership that you saw previously in your career versus how you lead these companies now, what do you notice about that? What do you see as differences or similarities?
Shall I go, Gemma?
Go ahead. I'll chip in.
I think a lot of the time I just felt like I didn't get it. I didn't get what the bigger plan was, the bigger picture. So I knew what I was told to do, but I didn't have a sense of like the money behind it, the budgets behind it, the connection to other wider picture. And I think that's me. I think that I own a lot of that myself. And so moving into the CIC, I think what we've done. So the first thing we started was this facilitated support group, and that's been going for 5 years, I think now. But what we've done from that is like we've got some ideas. We know we have an idea of what we think might happen and what might be useful, but we've just tried to have like lots and lots of feedback, and that you need that anyway as a CIC. You need your impact data to help with your funding bids and so on. But we've run focus groups to say like, what are we doing well? What else should we be doing? And I think like at this point now, I can look back and see how much those conversations have steered what we've done. So the dads group completely came from that feedback. The peer support worker completely came from that feedback, and her stay and play group. Those are the things that sort of come to my mind immediately. But that I think when you set up a CIC, you like ideally you need probably 3 directors is better, isn't it, Gemma? Like for funding bids, but I think you've got 2, we've got 2. But what we need to get to is to develop a much more clear steering group. So, and that would include the people who come to our groups, our peer support worker, the people that we work very closely with. So we work closely with our local Home Start, and that shapes what they do and what we do.
So it's just much more collaborative and much more co-created together with the community that you're working with, that you're serving. Yeah.
And I think the flip side to that is sometimes it can feel unclear. I'm not sure what's happening next. So there's a funding bid come out. What should we use that for? I'm not sure yet. And I think sometimes I'll think that's my leadership. That's an issue with my leadership.
Interesting.
But I think it is actually, it is organic. And you've just got to see what emerges almost.
Yes. Yeah. I can relate to that. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Gemma, your perceptions on how kind of leadership has shifted and how it's different in Altogether Human versus when perhaps you were working in NHS.
Yeah, so I can relate to a lot of what Amy's just said. I think my experiences of leadership within the NHS are of experiencing other people's leadership, and also having, to a certain extent, been in a leadership role. But a leadership role in the NHS never felt like it was my baby, right? Like it never felt like somebody sort of handed me my baby and said, you can genuinely lead on this thing, because there were these frameworks and the hierarchy above, and you still were being told you can't do it in that way. So you might receive feedback from people who are the community, who they'd say, I need this, or we need this, or even other services who might say, can we commission this? And despite being in a role that was supposed to have an aspect of leadership to it, you'd still feel stymied by, you'd have to go to the higher ups and ask for permission, and that wouldn't come. You can't do it in that way. And I understand, those frameworks, but I became very frustrated by them, because it really felt like we weren't able to do the best for the community. And so stepping out, I think, is a similar experience to something that Amy had said. Like, it can feel a bit vague at times, and sometimes that does mean that imposter syndrome raises its head, or that you feel like what am I really doing here? But having that ability to respond, sometimes it's slow because of the funding bids are slow, and you don't necessarily get feedback on those, but there are ways that you can respond to the needs that arise in the community, and developing networks in the community with other services or other practitioners, or sometimes even back into the NHS. So the NHS has recently asked us, can you provide something to us that is very much needed? That, I think, is a very different, helpful, regenerative experience of leadership in this kind of way.
Yeah, and I guess the question that kind of came up for me as both of you were describing those experiences is how much of a different experience it must be for the community that you're working with. When you're saying, maybe we would do consultation when we were in this big kind of top-down hierarchical organization previously, but the experience of having consultation done to you is very different than the experience of being part of a community interest group that is working together with you. What have you observed, or what kind of feedback have you had from people around that? I'm going to come to you again, Amy, if that's all right.
So just summarize the question again, Wendy. The feedback from the people
exactly. Like, what have you observed in or had feedback on from people in terms of how engaging with your organization kind of feels different, or how it impacts their life in a different way, or changes their perception of what psychology is about, or what the role is as a clinical psychologist, or providing these kinds of services?
I'm just trying to think. I think I think it's been refreshing. I don't know whether I've had like direct feedback about that kind of thing, but I think like that it feels like a different relationship with us. It feels like a more equitable relationship, I think. So like I'm just thinking about like tidying up after the group, like we all do it together. Um and that feels okay. It feels like joined, like people help me with like I got an A board today and I couldn't put the poster in, and she was like, shall I just do it, Amy? So that it feels like a different relationship, I think. And people do feel like they can tell me what they want or what we've done well. We were looking at moving premises, so I just asked if they could put it on the WhatsApp group and just say, Amy's thinking of this, what's the feedback? And it just came through. So I suppose like it feels more that it's theirs, perhaps that they've got a stake in it, and that they are motivated to drive it. And I think that comes across as well with how people use the groups. They're not looking to me to say, where do we go next? Like I might start it off, but that they know that what they have got to offer and to share is valuable, is really valuable. I don't know whether that's entirely answering your question, but those are the thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I didn't have like a correct answer in mind. I was just really curious about how that shifts the relationships and how that must be quite a different experience compared to, like I say, being in these kind of hierarchical, very top-down driven kind of,
I suppose it is. And sorry, Gemma, just the one thing that it changes it changes the nature of the boundaries, or like the boundaries are slightly different. And I suppose it's like just being alert to that, being aware of that, and how I am responding differently, but thoughtfully as well.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Oh.
Sorry, that was me.
Don't worry. No worries. So, Gemma, for you, you mentioned, that you'd done these consultations in the past, and now it presumably also feels different in terms of the relationship with the people that you work with.
Yeah. So I was just reflecting on things as Amy was speaking on that kind of topic as well, and my mind was taken to working with a Ukrainian psychologist who I hope doesn't mind me mentioning her here. But she found me on social media, saw something that I'd put out about being a psychologist in the local area, and got in touch. And I was thinking about that relationship. So it's not just the relationship with people who might use and help to sort of co-produce the service, but also people who are in other helping roles, who might also want to have some kind of connection. And she got in touch, and between us, we managed to get some funding for her to do some work with Ukrainian refugees, being a Ukrainian refugee herself here in the local area, and gathering groups of children and teenagers. And the feedback from them was beautiful also, about being able to use our physical space, being able to meet and talk to each other in their own language, being able to develop their own sort of network. And I really wasn't part of that, in that I wasn't at every group. I met them occasionally and waved, they knew who I was. But to be able to provide a space, physically, financially, and to a certain extent emotionally, for that to happen, I think that's one example of how those relationships can be really, really different.
Yeah. And that, again, it makes me, I'm going to write down a note here about getting into a discussion around the changing boundaries, because that seems like something that's really fundamental. Like it's a shift in how we view and negotiate boundaries as compared to what perhaps we've been taught as psychologists. I mean, even as an occupational psychologist, we're taught about being careful, and we're always careful and mindful about the boundaries that we kind of have with people we're working with. But for you as kind of clinical psychologists, what really shifted in that, would you say? Where would you see the biggest differences?
One thing that comes to my mind is like the place. Like I don't know whether anybody actually told me, but there was very much like a rule about don't work on your own patch. So like
I've
lots
heard
of
that as well. Yeah, so many times. Yeah,
so just don't work where you live because you might bump into somebody.
yeah,
No. And I think with the CIC, a social enterprise, you like it's community based. Why I wouldn't want to start this in any other community but my own. I don't have the
yeah,
investment. So, you know, my children are growing older now, but when they were younger, there was that overlap between the children of the families I was seeing and my own children. So there was always a risk of like bumping into people in your swimming costume at the swimming pool, like that kind of thing. And it is to be mindful of, but it's also it's what I've chosen, it's what I want to do, and I think I have to bring some of myself in that way as a parent, as a human parent, to the work that I'm doing, and that is some of the feedback that I have received, that it's been helpful when I've shared my own stuff. That kind of use of self-disclosure. But it's something I think for me as a psychologist, I've probably had looser boundaries than some people have, and it's something I've always got to be mindful of. How is this helping, or how is it not? And especially we've got people coming to therapy that come to groups and whose partners come to my groups, and I might be supervising somebody who's working with the husband of somebody. It's a lot of that, and that is community, isn't it? Those threads and networks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think similarly. It takes a lot of thinking about, and I think as important discussions with people when they first encounter you, or vice versa, about just how because they have to be comfortable with it too, right?
Yeah.
And I had it wasn't the swimming pool, thankfully, but it was a roller disco, and so a conversation with somebody afterwards about, I saw you on skates, that was brave, and I was like, oh, I didn't know it was brave, but just to have some of that discussion, and it's a different boundary, and probably I feel less like a clinical psychologist in some of those positions, and more like if I could choose a different label, probably I'd think community psychologist. And I think maybe the boundaries within those roles are a bit different. It takes a fair bit of thinking about. And still, there are some boundaries that I would maintain. So, for example, I run a group on an evening that I put out as a community event, and I don't think I would feel like it was appropriate for somebody who was doing a piece of therapeutic work with me to be in that group because of the person I am that I bring to that group. I feel like it's a different part of me, so it is a different boundary, and so it's just thinking about some of those and negotiating some of those. But I think it's beneficial. I like to be able to bring different parts of me to different parts of the work.
Yes. The time that we're recording this, you won't have had any opportunity to kind of hear any of the other episodes. But this whole topic of the healing experience of private practice, how, bringing different about how it can be a space where different parts of us actually can find a home and find a safe place. Is part of that healing experience of finding and being with and connecting with all those different parts of ourselves as well. Something that occurred to me as you were both describing that shift in boundaries was the difference between doing psychology, doing clinical psychology work, doing therapy, and being a psychologist. And I'm just, I guess, I don't even know if I have a clear question at this point, so bear with me as I kind of think through it. I was wondering at a point whether being more than a psychologist in the community, because as you described there, Gemma, at that point you were a woman on roller skates in the disco.
Indeed.
Amy, you were a woman there in your cozy in the swimming baths. We're not inhabiting our clinical or psychologist identity, perhaps, when we're in those places, even though other people might still say, oh, there's my, therapist in her cozy or whatever, or on roller skates. And I just wondered if it shifted or how that sense of identifying with all of our psychologist parts, or is it about, as you said, Gemma, just actually different parts of us now playing a role in doing psychology or being a psychologist? I don't know if anything coherent comes out of that, but just wondered about your reflections on the being, the doing, etc.
Yeah, I think it's identity, isn't it? And I suppose that's quite a lot of what I talk about in my work, like transitions in identity.
Right.
Become a mom or a dad, and if you're on, your world shapes up differently, doesn't it? And it does. And I think clinical psychology cuts through a lot of my parts. Like my kids know what I do.
Right.
They've got an awareness of it. Like my friends know it, and I'm okay with that. So actually, I suppose it perhaps brings a little more cohesion, or makes me think about being authentic throughout. And even that down to I wear the same clothes to work as I wear on the weekends, sort of thing. Kind of I suppose, that piece just runs through me, and it's not, I don't have to take it off and put it on again based on where I am, because the way I am in the group would be familiar if you did see me in Tesco's.
Yeah. So in that sense, it feels a bit more integrated as well.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, different parts of us integrated in different parts of our lives, as opposed to kind of siloed.
Yeah.
When I go here wearing these clothes, I'm doing psychology, and when I'm over here, I'm doing the swimming lessons with the kids or whatever.
Yeah.
For you, Gemma, has that also been a shift, or what's been your experience?
It's definitely been a shift for me, from moving from secure services, where issues about personal disclosure, or to what extent you bring yourself into that would be very different. So it's been a big and slow process in terms of shifting. I was thinking about that idea of those parts still being integrated or being siloed, and I don't know whether there's some in between for me, that it's not necessarily one or the other. It's not necessarily that I bring all of me to all of those scenarios,
right?
But that there are core principles or values that are integrated, but the extent to which I share something personal about me, or certain parts of myself, might flex depending on the situation. Like, it wouldn't feel appropriate if I was in working therapeutically with somebody, for me to talk about the same things as if I'm sitting stitching, doing slow stitching with a group of people who aren't in a therapeutic setting. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So it's that would still feel different, but I wouldn't necessarily feel different in terms of my identity within that. That makes sense? As a distinction.
Yeah. Where do you think these values and aspirations of being more connected with community, where do you think they came from? So it's the backstory of the backstory. Gemma, I know you're a fellow Northerner. I don't know if that had any. I mean, there was a little bit of a. So maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm making assumptions there.
It's interesting. My response, I think, also was interesting. So, yeah, I am in Manchester. Whether I consider myself to be a northerner, probably that's not where I began. So, yeah,
Right,
I'm
got
from the
it.
Midlands originally.
Okay.
Yeah, anyway, sorry.
Oh, it's north of London. You'd be classed as a northerner if you're
I would.
by the guys in the southeast, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so just thinking about that background then and those shifts and, what's the backstory that led you to kind of make that physical and metaphorical journey? Gemma?
I can. Yeah, I was thinking about this. And I'm not sure that I have a terribly good response to that. But some of the things that came to mind as I was thinking about it were some of my experiences of systems as a service user / customer / patient, and how they felt at odds with what I felt I needed at the time. So I had quite a tricky time, sort of late adolescence, early 20s, and found myself requiring services to a certain extent. But psychiatric services were not at all what I needed. And I think just being on the receiving end of some of those practices or experiencing how I was seen or treated by the system, probably, I don't think created the need for community connection, but certainly strengthened it, let's put it that way, or catalyzed it, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so looking back at some of that, I think I can see the role of those things. Actually, what I needed was a cuddle, like that sense of connection and community. And I was away from family, and that was tricky. And I think that has helped, looking back on that has helped me to think, what, that's just, it's not what I needed.
Yeah.
And so then I think I can apply that now to myself, but also to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. And Amy, for you, do you kind of see a connection with experiences that you'd had earlier or growing up through life and why that shifted you in the direction of a more community orientation?
Yeah, I think probably like my mum was a special needs teacher, and used to like the families that struggled. She'd bring those kids home and they stay the night at ours, So she's always had like a very much a helping attitude and like looking after people, So, and I think that was handed down to me. So I think that's part of the backstory, and then like the transition to parenthood as well. Like mine was reasonably straightforward, but it would not have been if I didn't have a community. If I didn't have like two sets of grandparents to help out, a wise sister who'd done it before, and friends that were there to sort of look after me. And I think sort of professionally, where I started from, I can track that back to like I worked in a school for boys with emotional and behavioural disorders. So that's why I went into CAMS, and then I worked in CAMS and I realised like, no, it's early relationships. So I went into perinatal, and then I was like, the NHS model is not working that great. So let's do something different. So I think there's those elements of it too that took it to perinatal, and just thinking about like the how like I suppose I recognise very much my privilege, and I don't take that for granted, and like what my responsibility then is if I have privilege that other people don't have, just knowing that like that I don't know how people do it when they don't have family around them, really, when kids are very young. It's so hard. And yeah.
And I think when I read on your website, it has that classic quote of "It takes a village."
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are obviously so many aspects of life and living, certainly in the UK at the moment. So, not necessarily speaking for other places, but, so many aspects about how we live that have kind of broken down community, broken down connection, just having to work super long hours in order to make ends meet just means that you don't get out like you used to. When I think about, even, dare I say it, as a teenager growing up, being able to go to the local pub to meet your friends may have been a little bit underage at the time. But there was a place for us to go, and I mean, we were allowed to go glass collecting at 16 in a pub when I was a youngster, and just, having jobs, being part of a community and all of those things. And a lot of that has really shifted and changed over the last 20, 25 years or whatever. And it makes me really think about, then, as psychologists, obviously we're kind of subject to some of those changes as well. Just like we're in other people around us are impacted by them, and I think we're impacted by some of them. So when I think about the kind of financial pressures that training as a psychologist puts on us after we, leave uni and so on, and then when I think about now the pressures that are on us as psychologists to kind of be able to pay the rent, be able to pay a mortgage, if we can get, a mortgage and so on. I'm just wondering whether, redefining success in terms and not just being beholden to, the grind culture, the hustle culture, is that something that's more of a challenge for psychologists and therapists, or are there aspects of what we do that kind of make it easier to say, let's do, something that's more socially and community orientated? I just wondered, about your reflections on any of that, really. How hard was it for you to think about redefining success on your own terms when you contemplated setting up a community interest company?
Have you got an answer?
Have you got an answer, Gemma?
I think, I don't know, we've both mentioned, I think, that coming out of the NHS, I mean, it's a risk, right? Coming out of something that's employment and giving up what actually is quite a good pension and those kinds of things, that's a risk. We've both mentioned that the only way that we could find to do that felt right with us was to do that in a community-oriented way. And it's not, I haven't found it easy necessarily, but I do think it provides a balance, and how you choose to balance that is kind of up to you. But it does provide a balance between doing things that may feel more like needing to put the hours in to get the income out, like, our sort of trading arm, our trading income, with other things that actually don't bring as much revenue. The grants, they don't pay in the same way. And then there's this sort of ongoing struggle in terms of the proportion of time that you put into one and the other, and then all of the unpaid tasks that come with running a company or having a premise or doing these other things. So I think, there's a struggle around that, but an importance in that struggle for me. And I think in what Amy said as well, in terms of really wanting to do that in a way that is in line with our values, because that's another kind of wealth, right?
Yes. I suppose that's what was coming to my mind. I don't know whether I ever thought about it in terms of success, because success is usually often a financially marked, isn't it?
Exactly,
I can do this. And again, there's something about, certainly for me, about privilege and being able to take that risk to reduce some earning whilst I set this up, So, but I think, like Gemma was saying about, it meeting your values, living to your values, that provides, I don't know if it's success or like a sense of doing the right thing, contentment. I'm doing the right thing in that I have created flexibility for myself so that I can take my children to school and pick them up most days, and that feels successful, I suppose, in that sense. And stop there on that kind of thing.
Yeah, in fact, you've reminded me of a few things that had kind of been rattling around in my brain about this topic of success, because one of the things that kind of really, I don't know why, but I feel like really averse to messages around 10 times your income. There's just I don't want to kind of be shaming about it, but I'm just saying personally, I kind of get the kind of, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up with a lot of the kind of things, or almost like pressure that's put on any business owner, small business owner, but also as psychologists, we pick it up around, have you got a 6-figure practice? Are you doing multiple 6 figures? Have you got a 7-figure this or that? And when I think about models of success, I love the thing about, well, maybe the wealth is not just in money. Maybe the wealth is in social connection or the quality of the relationships that I have. And, but fully kind of bearing in mind your point, Amy, about we can at least provide for ourselves a decent standard of living whilst we then aspire to these other forms of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there was this question of, can we broaden our perspective on what it means to be prosperous? Because to me, some of these other things we're talking about, and they do actually relate to how, like you said, this kind of sense of wealth, because if you have good social connections and good and well-resourced communities, your ability to kind of function in the world just improves dramatically as well. If it's not all about having to find money to purchase a service every time you need to do something as a member of a community. And I think the C word that you used, of contentment, Gemma was getting worried then. Where's she going with this? I don't know if you know, but I did my IFS training. I don't know if any of you have done IFS training. So the 8 C's of self.
Yep.
I reckon there is a 9th C of self. And to me, the 9th C of self connects it to regenerative communities and regenerative ways of being. And that 9th C is contentment.
Right.
So when I feel like we're kind of in connection with communities around us, when we are in connection with ourselves, when we're feeling that calmness, that confidence, compassion, clarity, all those good things, actually what also comes through is contentment. Means that there isn't this constant striving to feel as, from almost like a scarcity mindset that, the world can kind of leave us feeling like everything is scarce.
Yeah, and it's just like you're just battling against the whole structure of our society, aren't you? When to kind of keep reminding yourself that more isn't better, like more, yes, you need those baselines of stability, and to have safeness in that and where you live and how you access the things you need. But that constant battle against capitalism and having more to be to feel better. It's a hard battle to have every day, and to remind yourself of the other things that bring you a sense of wealth and contentment. It's a wide struggle, isn't it?
Yeah. So just thinking about breakthroughs that you've experienced around having a practice that feels strongly rooted in place and community. What were some things that maybe felt quite pivotal or felt like a big shift in your experience around that? I know, Gemma, you're kind of nodding there.
the nod of thought rather than answers, but
Right, okay.
yeah, I mean, I can try. So breakthroughs. I think I was nodding in recognition. Yeah, that and a thought really that for me it hasn't necessarily felt like big breakthroughs, but more connections or almost like, I don't know, I'm thinking of the Swiss cheese model now, which is, what was that about, risk assessment or something? I don't mean it in terms of risk assessment, but when things become aligned.
Yes.
Yeah, so less sort of massive breakthroughs, but almost a sense of synchronicity sometimes. So something coming back that you think, gosh, that was maybe a year ago that I last spoke to that person, and now they want to come back and make some kind of connection with a different opportunity. Or so I think some of the breakthroughs for us have been about that, about the network and about the connections made between people, whether that's between us and other services, or people who might commission a particular kind of service from us, so like a business to business model, or whether that is other kinds of connections. But I think that I would say that some of those have been our kind of breakthroughs. An example, somebody from the NHS neighbourhood development team coming back to us after some relationship building, but just bits and pieces of things, coming back and saying, do you know what we really need at the moment, and you might be able to do this for us, is something to do with children who aren't making it to school because they're anxious. Is there something that you might be able to do around that? And it's almost like these things kind of, there's a sense of them almost falling in your lap, but when you look at it, you think, actually, there's been a pathway to this. And there have been things that we've done in terms of building those relationships that have allowed those people to see us as somebody that might be able to do that.
Yeah. That just reminds me of when you're working in a way that's building a living system, the living system starts to take on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And kind of produce those kind of connections and that sense of momentum and kind of life repeating itself almost.
Yeah. It's like the mycelium under the forest.
That's it. Exactly. Amy, I don't know if there's any for you.
I think, like, picking up on something that Gemma said, like, it's hard to see a breakthrough in the moment sometimes, isn't it? It's when you look back and see where it's come from. And so, like, when I look back and think, we started this group 5 years ago and it is still going now and it's going strong. Like, that to me is a breakthrough, because then I realise, like, what we've done. Other breakthroughs, I think, probably like a bit more tangible, concrete, like signing a contract with another service, like as Gemma was saying, service to service work, a 5-year contract, and that was quite early. Like, early on, again, we'd been nurturing that for a while, but it eventually came through, and just that, like, like 5 years,
Yeah.
Now it's coming to the end, and now the figures look much smaller than they did originally. But that's that was a breakthrough. And probably lastly is like this, the organic growth, that we've got somebody who's used our service and is now at a point where she wants to volunteer to support other women and parents through our service, and she's like gold dust. You couldn't have, she's ideal. And that's a breakthrough, I think, to make that happen.
Exactly. And what that reminds me of with when we have models that are based on this kind of extractive machine way of working, we're always having to put inputs in, there's always fixed costs, and there's always kind of a proportion of what we're doing is kind of is just getting siphoned off by the system. And when we work in a more living systems and regenerative orientation, as I said, the system itself starts to replenish itself. It starts to sustain its own life, and therefore some of your costs can end up either not escalating as you grow, or kind of staying the same. And so running, I mean, that's just me as an occupational psychologist getting my occupational hat on there and thinking about those different ways of being for organizations. When, what have you learned from this experience that could help psychologists and therapists who have a social mission or want to create a change, but also want to make a living from their profession of psychology? What would be your kind of guidance or words of inspiration?
Well, I think the CIC model is a really good one, because unlike a charity, you can generate profit, you can generate income as normal, but you are in a position to apply for funds that will serve your social enterprise. So I think there's pros and cons to it, to whichever way you sit. But it's a pretty good start off, a pretty good jumping off point for protecting your income, if you like, and giving you scope to do more socially driven work.
Right. Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't be put off by it, because it's not beyond anyone's scope really to set that up. It's a bit arduous. It takes a bit of time, but if I can do it, anybody can do it.
I wondered whether that's where you were going. But the sense of that, I think I've had to become more comfortable with failure, probably. Make better friends with failure than I was before, and also get comfortable with slowness, and that it isn't always about growth in the way that we are sometimes fed the idea of growth.
Exactly.
It isn't always about wealth in the idea that we're fed that, and do it with people. Find your people. Do it with people.
Yeah, and don't be afraid of taking a risk. I'm pretty risk averse, but you have to step out of that comfort zone, don't you? That window of tolerance sometimes, and just see what can happen.
Yeah. And for you, has that? Would you say those experiences have kind of offered a sense or an experience of healing for you? What do you think has kind of healed for you, if you don't mind me asking?
I think, like, leaving the NHS, I felt like I was left with a high sense of personal incompetence, and I don't necessarily feel that anymore. And in private practice, I just got to start with a lot of therapy, and I'm moving away from that now. But that the opportunity to do that much just one-to-one therapy and develop those skills in a way that I hadn't really been able to do because of how the system's set up, how it's restricted, the service criteria that are in place. I think that developed my skills, and I could do CPD, could do training, which wasn't before possible. So it really offered me just an experience of work that was really valuable, and just this gentle space of reflection. Look, it's going okay. You have grown this much. That was the right thing to do. Try something different. That I think that has been really healing for me. And I don't have to be like a super driven leader. I don't. It's not me. But like Gemma was saying, if you find your people, that can come through those relationships.
Yeah. It's a different model and a different way of being. And as you said, it kind of builds so much capability and capacity into you and into the people around you. And it must be really I can imagine that's really kind of a healing thing to see that impact as well, the way that
Mm.
people have grown around you too.
Mm.
For you, Gemma, what have you found to be kind of healing through this process?
I think it's a really interesting question. And we were talking in a different group that Amy and I were in a while ago about the
Yeah,
idea of moral injury. And there really was an experience of moral injury for me coming out of the NHS. And I think part of the healing process for that, which perhaps isn't complete, it's an ongoing process, has been being able to address that in the way that I'm working now.
yeah,
So having more freedom to respond to people, having more awareness of my own personal ethic and how I am implementing that in the practice, and not feeling constrained as much by a system that isn't working well because of the stress that it's under.
yeah,
So, but also I recognise some of the things that Amy's saying as well. It's being able to do CPD to support ourselves and to nurture ourselves as well is hugely
yeah,
important. Being able to choose from a number of models, being able to work with people in the way that they need. And I think that that is healing for parts of us, particularly if we felt historically that we haven't been able to do that, and the impact of that injustice
yeah,
as well.
yeah, yeah. So I guess kind of thinking about time as well, how would you say you've designed your practices to be places that support your sense of well-being and your kind of healthy connection with community around you? What have you learned from the times when it hasn't worked?
I think like for setting up like just timescales for me that work. Like I've mentioned my children a couple of times, but just being able to work when I want to work, and I can't. When I think about the lack of flexibility that some businesses offer now, and how everybody needs to work, it makes my mind boggle. So that's one thing, and I think like we rent from another charity, and actually being, I'd love my own premises and I haven't got them, but actually being with other people, having people around us, and they've really helped us in other ways, like learning about grants, about how these things are done, that's been really helpful. So just not being in a silo, I suppose, it has been important. And then like making other connections. So Gemma mentioned the group we're in, and we meet not very often, but we meet, and that's really nice to have that anchored in. I've got a peer supervision group, which is really, really nice and positive, and just like trying, again, not very often, but every now and again, just spending time with people who do some work for us. And because it can be quite a lonely place, can't it, private practice?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So a lot of people do talk about that, and yet what you've designed is kind of based on, not being in isolation and not being kind of lonely. Absolutely.
I think there's something as well about our ability to recognise that the context has an impact on people's well-being, and our own included, right? And so I was thinking about a time in the NHS where I think I really wasn't particularly well as a result of some of the sort of toxic culture and the things that were happening. And the solution in other people's minds was to send me off to Ocky Health. And whereas the options that we have now
Go
are,
and fix yourself, Gemma.
yeah, go and fix yourself as an individual that has some kind of problem.
Yeah.
Whereas now, being able to acknowledge that there might be something about the system that isn't helpful, and being able to do something about that rather than pathologise people or pathologise ourselves, I think is huge for well-being.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so like you say, it's designed in that sense, What else would you want practitioners to know about feeling empowered, about that relationship with the local community? Because we talked about it earlier. It's a big shift. What would you want people to know about making that shift and feeling more able to have those connections and that strength of connection with their local community?
don't know. Because I think it's partly about where your passion lies, isn't it? And how that emerges in your community. So there was a natural kind of like bedding place for us with what we wanted to do, and where that was pitched, and who we might link up with. And but I think it's probably like knowing what your passion is, because you need to be passionate about it to keep the momentum going, don't you? And you need to be understand your own connection to that passion. That's a loose answer.
No, well, I think, what you were saying earlier about how in a very organic way, these things kind of emerge. And what I really hear from what you say in that is, sometimes we get a sense of almost like, in IFS, we call them trailheads, right? Sometimes we get these things that we just get really curious about. And there's a sense there of, if we follow our curiosity and our, the idea that this could be something that we're passionate about, actually it can open up into something that's really meaningful. That's a very kind of organic way of connecting with the things that we find really purposeful. So that's, I don't know if that's what you were saying exactly, but that's what I was kind of feeling when you were describing that process.
And similarly, I was thinking about finding spaces to occupy, and I suppose by that I also mean people to listen to and connect with who have similar kinds of ideas, and that the process can be really slow. I mean, I think I joined an organisation called Psychologists for Social Change many years ago, and I'm still part of them and enjoy thinking about things in a similar way. I don't know whether that's a trailhead or it's something else, but that's been an influence, and there are then other forums and places and spaces that you can occupy where people talk and think about these things, or the concept of community psychology comes about and you think, okay, I'm just going to learn a bit more about that, and what doors does that open, and how does that change my thinking about these kinds of things? And at some point that becomes, I feel more able to act in this way as well, I think.
I love that. Thank you so much for being here today and for this really rich discussion. I didn't really know where we were going to go with it, but I just find it so fascinating to kind of to think about I think it's an enormous shift in how we operate as psychologists. And I think I'm hoping, or I'm looking forward to the discussions that we kind of get following this this episode. So thanks so much for being here today. Where can we find you on social media, Amy?
We're on Facebook and Instagram, and I think we are the Koala Tree. If you search for that, then we should pop up.
Awesome, thank you.
Similarly, I can't remember exactly what they are, but if we're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, I think.
Right. Altogether human. Awesome. Thanks so much for that.
Thanks, Wendy.
I think the thing that really struck me in this conversation with Amy and Gemma was how that shift in relationship, changing from almost like being a psychologist where we do psychology to people, and, following values around being more connected with people and being part of a community, also then shifts so many other dynamics and relationships. So when we think about, what does leadership look like? When we think about what does collaboration and co-creation look like? And also, just coming back to these broader ideas that were around what does prosperity and wealth and contentment look like for us when we're in more of a place of connection with the community around us. And then also the time, and the timescales that things take, and how being in connection or being in community with the people that we're working with also means allowing the unfolding over time. And I just think that has some kind of profound things to teach us. Certainly, I'm kind of mulling over what that means when it comes to supporting other psychologists who are thinking about breaking the mold of private practice, that it's not always about do it quick. What's that saying from Meta or Facebook? Move fast and break things. It's like the opposite of that, right? And so, move slow and grow things. So, yeah, I think also being known in different ways and being known for different parts of ourselves, as well as for being, the psychologist parts of ourselves. That means being known in a more holistic way by the people around us. And I think that can also be profoundly healing as an experience. So thanks for being with us today. Thanks for listening to this conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing about what you think about healing through your private practice and being in connection with community. Have you experienced a toxic workplace or felt drained, disillusioned, or isolated in your practice? Perhaps it's time to transform your professional journey. Our Practice Accelerator and coaching programs are crafted to help you create a thriving practice aligned with your well-being and values. If you're curious about what this could look like for you, visit our website and explore how we can support you in building a fulfilling and sustainable practice. You don't have to navigate this alone. Let's thrive together. Join us at inspiringpsych.com. That's inspiringpsych.com.